All right, hello everyone, good evening. Thank you for joining North Carolina Humanities this evening for our virtual event. As you enter, if you'd like to kind of chat, let us know where you're joining from. We would love to hear that. I'll get started here. As Director of North Carolina Center for the Book here at North Carolina Humanities, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's virtual book discussion of The Kudzu Queen by Mimi Herman. I'm Melissa Giblin, and I'm so excited to begin our conversation this evening. Before we get started, I wanted to express that our thoughts are with the entire Chapel Hill community this evening in light of the events that took place on UNC Chapel Hill's campus. We are especially grateful that UNC Professor Marc Cohen is here with us this evening. North Carolina Humanities annually selects one book for young readers and one book for adult readers to be featured at the Library of Congress National Book Festival. These books are then added to the National Great Reads from Great Places reading list that includes books and authors from across the nation to showcase the rich culture and heritage of our country. As a nonpartisan statewide nonprofit, and as North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. NC Humanities is also North Carolina's affiliate Library of Congress Center for the Book. Our literary programs like this one tonight celebrate and promote the vital importance of books, reading, libraries, and librarianship, and North Carolina's literary heritage. We would like to recognize the chief officers of state library agencies and the State Library of North Carolina for their support in making this event possible. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on the Kudzu Queen, NC Humanities 2023 Great Reads from Great Places title for adults. Please note, any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and practice how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to our channel at NC Humanities and give those videos a like. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab, and we will get to those in the later portion of our evening. Okay. And closed caption is available through the CC button at the bottom of your screen. It is my pleasure to formally introduce our panelists for this evening. Mimi Herman is the author of The Kudzu Queen. She is a Warren Wilson MFA alumna, a Kennedy Center teaching artist, and a member of the AWP Board of Directors. Mimi co-directs Write-Aways writing workshops in France, Italy, Ireland, and New Mexico. You can find out more about her at mimiherman.com. Dr. Marc Cohen is a teaching associate professor of writing and literature at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. As a rhetoric and composition teacher, he specializes in writing in the disciplines, digital composition, speech, and basic writing. As a literature teacher, he specializes in world literature, multicultural American literature, popular genres, and 19th century British literature. Mimi and Marc, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Melissa, thank you so much for having us. And thanks to North Carolina Humanities and the North Carolina Center for the Book. I have been looking forward to this for so long.
And we are
Thank you very much for having us.
And we're looking forward to tonight's conversation. So I'm going to hop right in and start with Mimi. So Mimi, we've got a great audience joining us this evening. But for those who maybe haven't read the book yet, or maybe haven't made it all the way through, tell us what your book is about.
Well, it's about 15-year-old Maddie Lee Watson in 1941 in rural eastern North Carolina. So I have an invented county where she lives, Cooper County. And Maddie wants to be the Kudzu Queen, even though she has zero social graces, and she wants the Kudzu King, who's twice her age, to fall madly in love with her. So for those of you who aren't familiar with kudzu, think of ivy that wants to eat you. It's this absolutely gorgeous plant that grows up telephone poles and trees and basically took over the South after being intentionally introduced here. So for Southerners, I think this book's sort of like a slow motion horror film, because they're waiting to see what's going to happen with the kudzu.
Definitely. Ubiquitous throughout the South. Definitely know it's easily recognizable, and many are familiar with it. So I think as we kind of start there, and thanks for telling us a little bit about your book, Mimi. As you noted, the book does revolve around kudzu from the very, very beginning, right? In the beginning of the book, James Cullowhee, who is one of your characters, comes into town to tout the benefits of this plant, encourage its cultivation through government subsidies, and culminate with these fantastic kudzu pageants. So what do you think, or what was the significance for you of kudzu to the novel and to North Carolina? So we'll start with Mimi and then we'll go to Marc.
Oh, that's such a great question. So what you should know first is that people thought of kudzu as the miracle vine. The government literally paid farmers to plant it, paid young men from the CCC to plant it along railway embankments. So if you think about it, this was early 40s. We'd just been through the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. And here was this plant that might control erosion, could feed your family, could feed your livestock. So the Kudzu King in this book says a lot about the wonders of kudzu, and everything he says is true except one thing that I invented. I'm not sure you can make cigarettes out of kudzu. So people thought it was this really wonderful plant before it started taking over, because we have a bad habit in this country of importing something to solve a problem without importing the rest of its food chain. And here we have no natural enemies to kudzu except perhaps goats. So that's sort of the literal and historic part of it. In terms of the symbolic part of it, when I write, I don't think about symbol. I'm not like trying to inject symbols in with a hypodermic. But what I realize is that they kind of grow out of the story. And it wasn't until after I'd written the book that I realized how powerful a symbol kudzu was for the Kudzu King. You know, something that comes in, looks beautiful, seems like it's going to solve a lot of problems, and then turns out to take over.
Yeah, that is.
So I would. So of course, since I'm a literature professor, I do read in a different way than a creator would, like Mimi. And one of the joys I want to say about this book is I read it as highly metaphorical. And it's beautifully metaphorical at multiple levels. So of course, kudzu is this invasive species. It's again, as has been said, kudzu is not native to the South, but it was brought in as a miracle plant, and it does have a predatory nature. And I don't know how much we're going to give away. That's something I wanted to explore and ask is, you know, how much do I need to do a spoiler alert? I don't know, but I want to say that kudzu's predatory nature it has an analogy in the story's narrative. And so that is the first thing that comes to mind when I think of kudzu. It's not just a plant. It also represents a certain type of behavior, a certain type of predatory behavior that we see in the book. Another thing that I think kudzu, I read kudzu representing is the arrival of an innovation associated with modernity in a traditional community. Kudzu is just one innovation among many innovations. This story is set right in the early 1940s, at a time of great change. And this is an isolated, a relatively isolated agricultural community. And this would not be the only innovation offering progress and prosperity. And anytime that happens, a community has to evaluate how quickly are we going to integrate this into our community. It challenges traditional values. And that certainly happens here. I see this novel as in many ways, as a values-driven novel. And the arrival of Kudzu and its promoter directly challenges those values. And the community has to decide how they're going to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really good point there, Marc, about kind of how his arrival, right? A community that maybe doesn't see change very often, or maybe accustomed to kind of doing things in a way that is familiar, all of a sudden has this kind of flash come through with this man in this truck and his showy ways and this new thing that, you know, in a time where the entire country is really struggling, you know, economically, focused on the war, focused on, you know, production. It's a time of kind of shortage to help the war cause. You know, that appeal of extra money, right, especially for a community like this, you know, might prompt them to say, oh, we should maybe take advantage of this, you know, while we're being kind of given this opportunity. So that's a really great point. Let's maybe delve in a little bit more to the community itself. And Mimi, you told us Pinesboro and Cooper County are fictionalized, but they do come across as very authentically North Carolina. So what do you think your setting illustrates about life in rural North Carolina in the 1940s?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I grew up in suburban Raleigh. So I had to do a lot of thinking and research to figure out what it was like to be in the country, except for the fact that when I was a little kid, we lived on a farm. And so I have that sense of it. It's now been completely absorbed by suburban Raleigh, but it was a little outside the outskirts. And I've been a teaching artist in the schools for years and years. And so I spent a lot of time in Eastern North Carolina getting to know kids who were farmers and townspeople and their teachers and their parents. And I think it's essential when you write about place to honor the place. And in the South, Southern writers, when we write about place becomes a character. And I think the place is definitely a character in this book. And the way that you make it a character is you do everything you would do with a human character or an animal character. You think about what smells and sounds and tastes and sights you experience in that place, or that place would experience. So I wanted to create a place that that readers would feel like they could dwell in the same way that the characters dwelt there. And I wanted it to be not just a generic Southern locale, but something that was essentially North Carolina.
Marc, what do you think?
So at first I want to just say that I believe that Mimi does a fabulous job of honoring the place and places like Cooper County. Mimi really captures it in a variety of ways. And what I want to emphasize, and I've already said this, I think this is a novel that really foregrounds values, the kind of values that people aspire to in a community like this. I was really moved by it because I think we live in a cynical age. Some of these values, you know, people talk about values, but don't always live up to them. And one of the things I really love about this place is the aspiration toward higher values. You know, not every character, the characters aren't perfect, but there is an aspiration toward what I would call high values. And, you know, some of them are things like helping your neighbors. There's a lot of helping of other people in this book. doing the work that's necessary to support and maintain a healthy family, doing your duty to toward your parents, doing your duty to your children, respecting and looking after the disempowered and less fortunate, being a good and loyal friend, respecting the role of a full-time mother and homemaker, perhaps at a time when you wouldn't see that in contemporary literature. Being sensitive to other people's feelings, the exercising of community and individual self-restraint. These are all values that there's others as well, but my point is that it's not that this is a utopia that Mimi has created. People have their faults, but these values are here, and some people are living up to those values to such a great degree that I would even say that they're heroic in that regard. And for this reason, I think that there's something deeply nostalgic now about this book, about a place that aspires to values like this.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I think I'd like to also expand on this a little bit more, and kind of pick up on a little thread of what Mark mentioned. And that's kind of the interactions between the townspeople, directly in Pinesboro and then sort of the rest in Cooper County. How do you think the setting sort of contributes to their interactions, and even maybe the farm owners and the tenant farmers? Because like Mark said, I think there are a lot of relationships here. And I kind of caught that right at the beginning of the novel. Not quite attention, but Mimi, I'll let you expand on how you think the setting sort of contributes maybe to people's interactions with one another.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would actually call it attention. I think you're right. I mean, that's basically how I start out the book, about how it doesn't take long for the townspeople and the people from the county to start seeing each other as different species. And I think that's actually something that's very much true in our own time. We're very quick to judge other people and say, well, they're not like us, they're strangers. And so that's one of the challenges that Maddie faces. Maddie is, she comes from a well-off family for the country. So in terms of economics, she's probably at the level of a lot of the townspeople, if not higher. But she has parents who look after their neighbors, and they own the farms on which there are tenant farmers, but they take care of the people that are there, and they pitch in when it's needed. And I think it's one of the things I love about her parents. I always thought that, if you took Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird and split him in two, you'd get Maddie's parents. So I'm always looking to see how people can live up to being their best selves, and how they sometimes reveal their worst selves. And when you put pressure on somebody in a novel, one of those two things is going to happen, and sometimes both. I'm not sure I answered your question exactly. Should I say more?
No, I think you did. I mean,
Okay.
if you have other thoughts, if something comes to you after we kind of circle back with Mark, just chime in for those. So Mark, what do you think? How did the setting kind of contribute to the interactions between the townspeople and the farmers, and the farmers who owned the land, and then the tenant farmers who worked it?
Yes, so just to remind people who have read it, or let people know who are going to be reading it, there are a number of divides. There's sort of a variety of classes that are in opposition. So we have the town versus the country people, the townies and the country people. We have the property owners and the tenants. We have the blacks and the whites, and we even have churches we have the people that go to the Baptist church, and we have the people who go to I don't know if it's Pentecostal, but it's a much more of it's a church that has more in common with Pentecostalism. And my point about this is that you see the fault lines that could easily divide a community. I think that's one of the something that's really important about this book, is that you see that a community like this is held together. It's not a guaranteed thing that a community like this is going to be held together. It's held together by people, and how those people behave toward one another, and the values, whether they uphold the values of the type that I listed, is going to be the difference maker. And if that doesn't happen, you're going to have fragmentation. And so one of the ways I read this book is when I think about these divisions, and these classes do exist, and people are always putting other people in these buckets or boxes, you know. The people who inhabit the novel do that. But if a community is going to be a community, and I can relate to this because of the contemporary moment right now, so many of us want to live in a unified community, but we feel that it's being pulled apart by forces that a lot of us wish we could stop, but we can't. There are big forces that are pulling us apart. And maybe that's one of the reasons I see this I notice this so much in the book. There is a fragile piece, there's a fragile unity in a community like this. And I think it could be torn apart if people like, were it not for people like Maddie's parents that Mimi mentioned, who are really uniquely high-minded, ethical, moral people who just keep things stitched together.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it occurred to me that there's so many divides in the story and in our culture now. You know, there's town and country, there's racial divides, there's economic divides. And so what I wanted to do was to write something that was as true as possible and honest about those divides existing. Somebody once told me, you know the score, but you don't keep it. And that's the best compliment I think I've ever gotten. And so I wanted to describe these divides honestly, but I was also interested in characters for whom the divisions were permeable, you know. And so I talk about Danny, Maddie's older brother, who manages to be liked by everybody, not because he's trying, but just because he's that kind of person, and how people listen when Maddie's father talks, and how Maddie's mother was the kind of girl in high school that was comfortable in all kinds of groups. And I think, you know, now that I think about it, I'm remembering junior high school for me. And, you know, I was in the Methodist youth group and the Catholic youth group and the Jewish youth group. And I hung out with, you know, the nerdy kids, and I hung out with the cool kids. And I just really like that concept that those divides don't have to keep people apart. And I think that's a lot of what this book is about.
Yeah, I think we can kind of delve into that too a little bit with Maddie. I want to get into the characters as well. I see her permeability, especially with Rose and you know, Lynette, and just kind of different her ability to sort of fit in different social groups, even though maybe sometimes she feels not like she doesn't quite fit in. But so Matilda, or Maddie, is the narrator of the story, and she's 15, but she is surrounded by many female figures, and I'll name a few. Aunt Mary's spirit, to give us that gothic aspect. Mrs. Watson, her mom, who we've mentioned, Mrs. Sampson, Mrs. Johnson, Lynette, Mabel, and Rose, and that list probably can go on. So kind of looking at these women, Mimi, how do you think these women help influence Maddie over the course of the novel? And how do they kind of show that importance of female bonding and family and friendship?
That's such a great question. And I think it's central to what I was trying to do in the book, because the stage setting is Kudzu, and, you know, the Kudzu is threaded all the way through, but it's really a story about Maddie coming of age. It's really a story about Maddie experimenting. And I don't write memoir. I don't write autobiography. But the one thing that is sort of mine in this book, besides a few characters like Sassafras the cow is a real cow, but the one thing that's mine is that I've always been fascinated since I was that age, 14 or 15, by the way that girls that age try out their sexuality, and sometimes it gets them in trouble. And so they're kind of trying it on for size, and they want a response, but they don't know what that response is going to look like. And when it's something that's threatening to them or scary, they have to deal with it. And so Maddie needs this community of women and girls. Her mother is a wonderful example for her, integrity with a sense of humor. That's kind of how I see her. And Mrs. Johnson, as heartbreaking as she is an example of someone who tries to keep her family together. I love that you brought up Aunt Mary. Somebody once told me that Aunt Mary was their favorite character. And I love the fact that, someone who's dead throughout the book is their favorite character. So I love that you brought up Aunt Mary and Mrs. Sampson, because they don't start out as being people that Maddie thinks very highly of. Mrs. Sampson's kind of hoity-toity, and, Maddie makes fun of her, and Aunt Mary she thinks of as really mean. And throughout the book, they change. And so my question for anybody who's read the book is, do they change, or does Maddie's perception of them change as she matures? So that's sort of the grown-up women. And then there's the people Maddie's age. So Maddie has a best friend and an oldest friend, and her best friend is Lynette. And she lives next door, and Lynette has grown up in poverty. And I think one of the things that Maddie learns from Lynette is that strength can be quiet, and that there are always solutions to the most difficult problems, because Lynette faces some of the most horrible stuff in the book and manages not just to survive, but to thrive, also with the help of Maddie's family, especially Maddie's mom, I think. And then Rose, who's one of my very favorite characters in the book. Rose is African-American, and early in the book, you get a sense of people who are African-American being invisible. They're sort of in the shadows, they're in the corners. Rose is fierce, and she demands that Maddie be fierce. And so I think in some ways, Maddie learns more from Rose than almost anybody else. And as I was thinking about things to talk about tonight, I thought, you know what? It's not a word I use all the time, but I think if there were one word to describe what matters to me in this book, it's integrity. And that's what she learns from every woman in this book. Maddie goes through some hard times herself, and she emerges fierce and powerful and brave, not just in her own defense, but in the defense of other people who can't defend themselves. So, and she learns that from these amazing women and girls in her life.
Yeah.
I think you absolutely succeed in communicating that value of integrity and honor. It comes through absolutely. And I want to add that I think it's not limited to the female solidarity or solidarity among women. I think it's also the men. And I wanted to add this just to give some examples. The way that Mr. Watson, Maddie's dad, looks after Luther Moore, his tenant farmer, the way that Danny, Maddie's brother, and his friends help out on the neighbors' farms, and also with the kudzu effort. And then the way that Carl and Danny end up joining the war effort. I could give more, but the point is I think that this idea of community, it's really refreshing. And I think anybody who lives in a community where they don't know their neighbors, where they feel like they have to pay somebody to help them out with a move or whatever, for any reason, I think you might feel a little wistful when you read this book, because this is a community where people help each other out, and it's not and to one degree or another. Now, what Maddie's family does for Lynette's family is above and beyond, and that's one of the points, and we'll probably talk more about that. There's a lot of helping out in this community, people helping people, which really stands out in our community, where we've achieved privacy in our age, where to the point where many of us don't know our own neighbors. And I think to see a different kind of community where everybody's interconnected and helping each other out is a little bit breathtaking. And we appreciate it. And that's one of the values of this book, is to see what a community can be.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm so glad you also brought up the men, Mark, because I grew up in a kind of feminist household, and I have two fabulous sisters and mom and stepmother and amazing dad. But I didn't want to write a book that was just for women. I wanted to write a book in which everybody had strengths. And one of the things that surprised me and that I loved was that shortly after the book came out, I started getting play-by-plays from men who were reading the book. Some I knew and some I didn't, telling me, oh, I'm at this part and this has happened and don't bother me, I'm reading, and then this has happened and this has happened. And so one of the most thrilling things to me about this is that the book is not for any one group of readers. There are so many different kinds of people who see themselves in this book, or see their ideal selves in this book, or their not so ideal selves in this book.
Yeah, definitely. How did you go about creating Maddie's brothers? Because they're an integral part of her family unit as much as her mom and dad are. I think she does wind up spending probably a lot of time with her brothers. So how, growing up with sisters, did you create that sibling relationship, Mimi?
Oh yeah, well, I went through about 5 years from my late teens to early 20s. Did you ever read the book that I think it's called Are You My Mother? So a children's book. And so I was constantly trying to get boys to be my brothers, because I desperately wanted brothers. I thought an older brother would be really awesome. My mom would talk about her older brother and she would say, my older brother's going to beat up your older brother. My big brother's going to beat up your big brother. So I wanted a brother that was going to look out for me and defend me and understand me. And so I think Danny's my fantasy older brother. You're not supposed to have crushes on your own characters, but if I do, it's on Danny. And then, everybody's got a younger sibling who's a pest. Not me. My younger sibling is perfect, as both of my younger siblings are perfect. But everybody else has younger siblings who are pests, but who in the long run are the people that get you. And I found Danny and Joey to be really easy to create. And it's funny because actually I say to create, I'm not sure I create characters. When I start a book, I hear voices. And I don't know what the book's going to be until I hear the narrative voice. And so when I started hearing Maddie, she created Danny, she created Joey, she created her parents, and the mean girl Glynis, and her best friend and her oldest friend Lynette and Rose. So they were there waiting to come onto the page, and I love them.
Thank you, Mimi. Mark, anything else to add about Danny or Joey?
Not on that question. I'm going to hold off because I think that was said perfectly, and I have so many things I want to talk about, but I'm not going to follow up on that one.
Okay, great. So we'll kind of move into our next question. So the novel, definitely without giving spoilers, does contain some moments of darkness and things that are very serious, and but as we've kind of referenced previously, the town really does come together to protect its most vulnerable. So many of the characters display a lot of agency and heroism at the conclusion of the novel. So Maddie and throughout as well. Maddie, Danny, Rose, Mrs. Sampson, and Lynette. So whose actions kind of made the biggest impression on you, just overall, as kind of that heroic, ending for Maddie and this cast of characters that are all sort of involved as this story culminates with the Kudzu pageant? Mimi, I'll turn that to you.
Can I switch up the order and let Mark
Mhm.
answer that first? Is
Sure.
that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so, well, I have to say that Maddie is the foremost heroine in the book for me personally. I will say that one of the things I want to point out about the book is that there's a cinema motif throughout that's interwoven throughout the book, and that cinematic element appears in very dramatic form at the end of the book. I'm not going to give it away, but it's very exciting. And Maddie is at the heart and soul of that. But I'm going to say something that's perhaps unexpected, maybe not. Mimi may say, "Oh, that was." She may think that it's was the main intent, but I think there's a subtle hero at the end, and that is the community itself. At large, the community exercises great restraint at the end of this highly cinematic climax of the book. And that restraint, to me, is the culmination of a chain that starts with Maddie's parents. To me, Maddie's parents, this book communicates to me something very profound. I feel like I learned something very valuable from this book about individual leadership that starts in the family. And Maddie's parents are the embodiment of that integrity that Mimi was talking about, the embodiment of that sense of honor. And it becomes kind of contagious. It spreads out through their children first. And then I believe that Maddie, through her actions in the climax of the book, spreads out that integrity that originated in her parents, passed through her, and now it is passed on to the community. That's my interpretation. It's not stated explicitly, but I believe that that is really, it's really there. It's a chain, and it starts with the family. And I think that there's a lot to learn from this. And it really, to me, communicates the importance of leaders within all types of leaders, but including those that exist within a family, a mother and a father who strive to live up to their highest ideals and live by that integrity that Mimi was striving to communicate. And I do believe, like Kudzu, it spreads through the children into the community, and that is why the family, that is why the community in the end is able to also share in that collective heroism.
Mimi, what are your thoughts on that? Again, kind of the heroism of your individual characters and the community at large.
Wow, Mark, that's such a great description of it and a great perception. I'm a huge believer in a barn building. You know, I love the way communities will come together to help the people that need that kind of help. And I think in some ways, even though this isn't anywhere near a literal barn building, there's that sense of the community coming together to help the people who are most vulnerable within it. So I can definitely see that. When I teach writing, one of the things that we often say is this idea that every character in a book thinks they're the main character. And if you write a book really well, every character could be the main character. I mean, the reader could imagine, what if, Lynette told this story, or what if Aggie told the story, or what if Danny or Joey told this story? And so the other piece of that is they've only got their own puzzle pieces. They don't have it all. And sometimes their puzzle pieces are wrong, and they have to learn to kind of let go of perceptions that they'd had in the past. And that takes a certain kind of courage to believe something and then to get new evidence and decide, actually, there's another way of looking at it. And I think that happens at the end of the story. So Maddie pulls it all together. I mean, she's at the center of it. But I just think Danny shows incredible courage in that way. I think Aggie, who's a very quiet, quite literally quiet part of the story, shows incredible courage. I think you see Lynette's courage. You see Mrs. Sampson reach out to take care of everybody in a way that the Mrs. Sampson we met at the beginning of the book didn't seem possible, didn't seem capable of doing. You see Rose saying, this is what happened and you need to do something about it, and demanding that of Maddie, which for that time, for a young African-American woman to demand that of, a young white woman, that could have been really risky. And yet she does it, and she's absolutely right to do it. And so every single one of them is essential to making this book and this community safe at the end.
Yeah, I think if I can interject for a moment, I think I was most compelled by Rose and Mrs. Sampson as well, in a parallel sense to what kind of Marc was saying, where I think the expectations for a rural community would be that they, may be tempted to seek justice in their own way, or take the kind of law into their own hands. And Mrs. Sampson is really instrumental in saying, like, we aren't going to do that. We're going to let, justice and due process take its course. Yes, there has been egregious things that have happened, but we are going to live up to those higher kind of ideals like we've set for ourselves. We don't have to kind of be that, whatever is expected of us. We won't kind of go down that road. So I personally felt Mrs. Sampson and Rose really definitely showed that agency, and kind of helped, Mrs. Sampson listening to Rose, like you said, Mimi, for a white woman of the time in her position, right, as the mayor's wife. Is she going to listen to this child who most adults, may be aloof to that, or like not maybe give it the most credibility, but she does, and she listens, and I think responds in a way, and is kind of also crucial in leading the community sort of to that point at the end and the conclusion. So any other thoughts on kind of characters, or why it was maybe important to include those moments at the end and show that resiliency of the community? Any other thoughts on that, Marc or Mimi?
Nothing to add to that I haven't said yet.
Well, I will say that sometimes a book is made in what you take out. And originally there was a lot more of the ending of the book. There were pages and pages that I took out after I thought the book was done, that were sort of all about the resolution, what I thought was the resolution. I don't want to give too much away, but they took away from that moment by diminishing them. Somebody has told me that, I give too many presents. Like, if you give 2 presents, it makes both of them seem not as valuable. Like, I'm hedging my bets. And so sometimes you can overwrite a book and hedge your bets that way. And when you take that out, all of a sudden the essence is there. And I think that's what that moment is about, the essence being there.
Move on to kind of my final question for the evening, and then I see some questions popping up in Q&A and chat, so I want to make sure we have time to get to those as well. So my kind of final question for you both, is there anything that you are working on currently that you would like to share with the audience? So Mimi, we'll start with you, and then Marc, you can tell us about some of the cool things that you're doing in your classes that tie into this book.
He's doing very cool things. So I'm working on the next novel, and I'm really excited about it. It's set in Ireland in the mid-'80s, which is when I lived there. So I went to Carolina, and then after I finished Carolina, I went to live in Ireland for a year because I wanted to live in a place where I didn't know anybody and I didn't have a job and I didn't have a place to live, and see if I could make it on my own. And I found that it was a fascinating place to be because there were these traditional pubs right next to like hip nightclubs like Studio 54, but Dublin style. And so I started creating this novel about a young woman about the age I was when I was there. And there is the missing grandchild of a big muckety muck from the IRA who's in the book. And this young woman's best friend is a drag queen named Holly Unlikely. So it's a bit of a mystery, it's a bit of an adventure, and I am having the best time. I like to write about times that are not necessarily the vivid moments in history, but the times where things start to shift seismically. And so that's another one of those. Mark, I'm dying for you to talk about what you're doing.
One thing I want to say, and this is one of the things I'm excited to see about this book that you're writing right now, is the psychological insights that appear in your work. As you were describing it, I was thinking about how much I appreciated the psychological insights of that come forward in your book. I think, like many novelists, you have a gift for psychology, and some of that is, some of it is social psychology, and some of it is personality psychology. But that's one of the, when I think of your writing, that's another thing that excites me. I've already mentioned a number of things. I think there's a lot of insights in your work, and I want to include psychology, your understanding of social psychology and personality psychology. So I'm excited for what's to come with that next book. So for me, I'm very passionate about my teaching. I do a lot of experiential education. I believe that probably Melissa, when she learned about my work with the North Carolina Botanical Garden, that was probably what helped create this panel. I do work with the North Carolina Botanical Garden in a collaborative unit every semester with first-year students, and that we study invasive species, and kudzu is one of those invasive species, and it does devour everything in its path. There's no question about it. And the North Carolina Botanical Garden spends a tremendous amount of time trying to create gardens that maintain the unique flora and fauna of North Carolina and the region the various regions within the state. And we study that in my class. And I will just also mention that I'm about to embark on a unit with the owners of James Taylor's childhood home, which has recently been renovated. It's a beautiful mid-century modern home of architectural importance and historical importance. James Taylor is from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm very excited to develop a new unit with that work of architecture at the center.
That's
Awesome.
going to be so cool.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Mark. I'm sure some of our attendees in the chat might be wondering how they can audit a class with you or learn more about heading over to the botanical gardens while in class. That sounds like a lot of fun. All right, so Melanie, I think we have some wonderful questions in the chat. My colleague Melanie is here assisting me off screen, but she will be joining us verbally momentarily to read off those questions.
Melissa, and thank you both, Mimi and Marc, for such a great conversation tonight. I'm really pleased to be here and listening to it, and really appreciate your insights and sharing your thoughts with us this evening. If you do have a question, please continue to send those to us either in the chat feature or the Q&A feature. We'll try and get to all of them this evening as time permits. First, I'm going to ask a question that comes from us, kind of, Marc, kind of touching on what you all had just, or what you just recapped. And hopefully you can both touch on this in different ways. But we have a question. How did kudzu historically arrive in North Carolina? Was it through government subsidies promised by quote unquote con men, as you portray in your novel, Mimi? Or how did this kind of come to be? If both of you want to touch on that.
Mimi, I'm going to defer to you because I know less about the history, the early history of kudzu than what's happening with it now.
Okay, so kudzu was originally brought over for, I want to say, I think it's the 1896 World Fair as and as an exotic plant. And so for a long time, it was sold just as an ornamental from one nursery. And people would plant it the way people plant wisteria, which I always think is another really bad idea. And then in the 30s, 40s, the Department of Agriculture started promoting it. So it wasn't just these con men. There were lots of people who were promoting it. And the Department of Agriculture produced pamphlets on the proper propagation of kudzu. So you can still find these pamphlets on the best ways to promote to grow kudzu before they declared it a noxious weed some years later. And as I mentioned earlier, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, paid young men to plant it along railway embankments, which is why if you take the train in the South, you can still see railway embankments covered with kudzu. So those were two ways that it spread, so to speak. There's something else I was going to tell you about it. And it really does do amazing things. Like it's well thought of in Japan. So you can make flour out of the roots. You can make jelly out of the flowers. It's a headache cure. Apparently, it's also an alcoholism cure. You can make paper out of it. And there's a group of people in the mountains that are figuring out great things that you can still do with kudzu. There's lots of people that make baskets out of it. But it was brought in as something that was really highly valued. And there was a named Channing Cope in Atlanta who wrote for the Atlanta Constitution and also had a front porch radio show. And he was this charming fellow and he promoted it heavily. And he created something called the Kudzu Club of America. I think I've got that right. At one point, there were over 1,000 members. So yeah, it wasn't just a music man, con artist kind of thing. It was supposed to be this wonderful thing that was going to be really beneficial to the South and especially to North Carolina and to the whole South. Great question.
Yeah, and Marc, you mentioned you are more maybe familiar with what is going on with kudzu kind of in the present days.
Well, what I'd like to just say is this is less about kudzu specifically, but more about invasive species. One of the things that we learned from horticulturists who try to maintain the local flora and fauna is that they have a very complex relationship with the nursery business. And this is the thing that is an ongoing issue. And organizations like the North Carolina Botanical Garden try very hard to develop relationships with local nurseries. Nurseries are businesses and they are in the business of making a profit and they try to meet the demands. And it's a fact that many buyers of plants, people like all of us, enjoy exotic plants. And when someone says this beautiful plant is from Japan and it will grow beautifully in our climate, and look how beautiful and interesting it is. It's unlike anything you've seen in your garden, right? Well, we're selling it. And that is the way a number of the nursery business is one of the ways that invasive species are introduced. And they're not always problematic. That I want to make sure that's clear. And the North Carolina Botanical Garden absolutely considers nurseries to be their partners, and but it's one of the issues. We also have it's an impossible job. The Border Patrol, the organizations that protect the United States borders have an impossible job trying to prevent invasive species from entering. And the last thing I'll say is that North Carolina's climate is very similar to that of Southeast Asia. And for that reason, a number of our invasive species that we're dealing with are plants from Southeast Asia.
Thank you. Melanie, do we have, I think we've got a few more questions, right?
100% we do, yeah, and great ones at that. So thanks for continuing to send those to us. And Mimi, Marc, thanks for that. Next question I have is, small towns can be places where pettiness is elevated to an art form. So Mimi, do you find it therapeutic to create a small town world where people do what you want them to do? That one made me laugh too.
I don't know. That makes me sound kind of controlling. Yes, I do. It's really nice to make people behave. Not everybody behaves in my small town. Some people, well, everybody behaves in one way or another, but some people behave incredibly badly. But yeah, it's nice to be able to help people find their higher selves, at least fictionally, and perhaps as an example for real life. Yes.
I think also there is a particularly bratty teenager. I won't get into too much detail, but Glynis, I think her last name's pronounced Carpentier. Glynis is one of the teenagers who's particularly petty, and there's a lot of fun there. And one of the things that I think is a pleasure of Mimi's writing is that sometimes there's a satirical approach that you often see emerge in her writing when she sets forth a character like this. It doesn't become judgmental as much as humorous or satirical. And so, for example, when the mothers of the Kudzu Queen pageant reveal themselves in the course of the Kudzu Queen pageant, we don't feel as if these characters are being judged. It's a loving, satirical look at bad behavior, or it's not even always bad behavior. I feel strange calling it bad. But it is satirical. It's a critique with love, and I think that that's one of the things that no character thinks they're a villain. I'm sure that this is a concept that Mimi teaches her writing students, and she doesn't treat any of her naughtier characters as villains.
Thanks. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and I think all very, very realistic. I mean, I think we all probably grew up with a Glynis or knew a Glynis. It's all part of life with with others in any kind of town. So, all right, Melanie, do we have? I think we've got probably a few more questions, right?
Absolutely. Marc, Mimi, you both touched on this a little bit in our prior conversation, but can you talk a little bit about the coming of age aspect of the book? This audience member would like to know about Maddie becoming a young woman and Danny transitioning into a breadwinner / college student.
Marc, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, one of the things, so there are several coming of age storylines, and I'm going to add the coming of age of this community to the list. I do believe that this community has an awakening. I always think of coming of age as being moving from innocence to experience, from child to adult, from ignorance to education. There's so many different transitions, and I think I just want to remind everybody what Mimi said earlier about a girl experimenting with her sexuality. I think that plays a very important part in Maddie's coming of age. I think Danny's coming of age relates very much to his optimism and positive outlook on life. He's an all-American type kid. And he really finds himself swept up in the promotion of kudzu and all of the prosperity that's promised in its wake. And you know, that's a hard pill to swallow when he finds out some things about these things he believed. The narrative really slaps him in the face, which is the way life is and the way life can be. And that's hard. And I think that the final thing I will just say is I really do think that an analogy, whether it was consciously made or not, there is an analogy in the book between the loss of Southern culture in the face of modernity. I'm not saying it's lost completely, but the kudzu, as I read it, is associated with novelty that comes from modernity. It's associated with agricultural science. It's promoted by people who use the rhetoric of agricultural science to promote their ends. And I think that this is also a coming of age, a loss of innocence for a Southern community that's going to be changed forever, no matter whether they adopt kudzu or not.
Mimi?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we never really, when we talk about coming of age, is that it's almost always going to be painful. You're almost always going to have to let go of something to take on something else. And so there's a grief about coming of age. There's a sense of loss. And I think both Maddie and Danny end up having to sacrifice something in order to grow up. And there's even a moment where Maddie realizes that Danny, who's about to go to college to study agricultural science at NC State, that he's going to be different and that she's going to be different too. And I think when you're a teenager and you're growing up, it always seems really wonderful. Like, I'm going to be able to do the things that the cool kids do. I'm going to be able to do the things that grown-ups do. But sometimes you get that and you're not sure if you really want it.
That's well said. Thank you, Mimi. Melanie, I think we've got time for maybe another question or two if we've got them.
Sounds great. We have an audience member that saw a story on the news about the quote, death of local papers, and that contributing to our not knowing and getting along with our neighbors. This person asks, what role, if any, do you think or believe or hope that fiction can play in being human and neighborly?
Wow, that's an intriguing question. Do you have an idea, Mark, or should I start? You start.
Well, I'm happy to start. So
Yeah.
I teach a lot of contemporary American literature, which is multicultural by definition. And these are very important classes. They're very popular among students. And I think, you know, even a university like UNC Chapel Hill, which is very diverse, it still can be very balkanized. You know, people sit with people who look like them in the dining room. It's not, of course, 100% this way, but, you know, it's true that people don't mix as much as they could or they should. And so literature classes like the type I like to teach, they open doors and they allow people in a way that feels safe to explore the lives of their neighbors. And then they get into discussions about that literature. And And then the door opens a little wider. And the next thing they know, they're talking and they're having chit chat the way that they might have only done before with people who were just like them. I think literature is a door opener. I think it brings you into the mental world of other human beings in a non-judgmental way, and it allows you to identify with them, and it has a magical effect of making you realize the truth, which is that we're all at the core human beings with a great deal in common, much more in common than any differences we might have. That's my belief about what literature can do. And if local papers used to, and local news in general, used to serve that purpose, and unfortunately, here we are in a state where that rarely happens anymore.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been reading as long as I can remember, and I think I've learned about the world through reading. This is going to sound like a sort of strange metaphor, but my aunt once gave me this really beautiful shawl that didn't seem like me, but I grew into being the sort of person that would wear that shawl. And I think in some ways, every book we read allows us to grow into a new understanding of other people. And that, we often talk about facts versus truth. There's always some facts in fiction, but fiction's really more about truth, and it's about the truth of human nature. And so to me, every book that we read, every book that we write is a gift to help us understand our neighbors and the world, which is also neighbors.
Thank you, Mimi and Marc, for sharing that. Let's see, Melanie, do we have time for maybe one more question?
We do, and I appreciated that last question. That's really kind of at the heart of what North Carolina Humanities is all about as well, right? I mean, bringing folks together to have conversations like this one tonight. And so towards the end of the program, I'll re-put in our website, but we really encourage you to check out our other programs and our other activities across the state. And really at the heart of all that we're doing is, again, just bringing community together to kind of share in those similarities and differences and get to know our neighbors again, right? So last question, I'm going to kind of combine a few here just for the sake of time. And again, appreciate you all sending those in the chat and the Q&A. Someone remarks, the depth of personalization is extraordinary with each of the Kudzu Queen characters. In your writing and tying this into your new book, Mimi, how does place and community inform your characters and their voices?
People grow out of places, and then they create the places in which they continue to live. I think, gosh, how do I put this? When you're writing a book and it's going really well, you're living there. And you're in the room with the people that are in the book. And one of the things that I always try to teach my students is to pay attention to everything. And I think if you do that, then your characters, your place, your story can't help but come alive.
Thank you, Mimi.
Yeah, I want to take the question in a slightly different maybe direction than expected, because those characters that are being alluded to are part of the beauty pageant. And I want to talk about Mimi's treatment of the beauty pageant. One of the beauties of a really good writer is they defamiliarize the world for us and allow us to see things in a new way. All of those individual characters that the question allude to make up parts of this beauty pageant, the Kudzu Queen pageant. It's a beauty and talent show. And but I feel as though by reading this book, I am seeing beauty pageants and beauty and talent pageants in a new way. I think that Mimi Herman has defamiliarized it for me. I think that one of the things I realized, because this pageant is embedded as a story that has strong sexual themes, that the beauty pageant can be seen as symbolic of the kind of sexual selection that goes on in agriculture, and that we do when we in our media with the body and in general. These women are paraded in front of the community as kind of objects and with talents, and it is a kind of Darwinian sexual selection.
Wow.
And it wouldn't have occurred to me if it hadn't been juxtaposed with this incredible story about this predatory character, which I won't get into much detail, but where a kind of sexual selection is going on there at that level. And so I believe that, just to return, is for those of you who haven't read the book, or for those of you who are reflecting on it, to think about the symbolism of that Kudzu Queen pageant and how it is a kind of illustration, a living dramatization of Darwin's sexual selection, which of course relates to the idea of a plant that is highly fertile and will take over the community if not stopped.
Wow, Marc, this is why you want literature people to read and talk about your books. It's really fantastic. It's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you both Marc and Mimi. We're going to get wrapped up for the evening, so I just wanted to say thank you for your conversation. This was very insightful, and I feel like even after having read it, I still learned a lot from both of you about the story. So I want to also say thank you to our wonderful audience for attending and for asking such great questions this evening. We really appreciate your time and your engagement. Again, Melanie had referenced she was going to put our website in the chat. So you can visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about other upcoming events and our other programs, and also to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with everything that NC Humanities is doing. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and I hope everyone has a great evening and happy reading.
Thank you
So much. What a lovely evening.